Good morning, everyone. This is part 3 of 10-part series on learning math and context connected to the 2022 Minnesota math standards that will be fully implemented in Minnesota in the 27-28 school year. And I'm excited today to talk about studying your students and their communities. This is part 1 of a 2-part series. My name is Sara Werf. I'm the MDE academic standards specialist for math at the state. And I'm excited to share with you this webinar, like the other webinars, is recorded and will be placed up on the MCTM YouTube channel sometime in the near future. And this is session 3. There's all kinds of resources that I've linked. Anything that I'm talking about in this webinar, I have linked in that folder, book recommendations and all kinds of things. And I also have my PowerPoint there available to you. I'd like you to start by thinking about the best math teacher you've ever seen teach in person. What did they do or not do that made you think that they were the best person you'd ever seen teach? This is a picture of the best person I've ever seen teach. He is a middle school teacher in the school district that I worked in forever. He's the person who encouraged me to become a leader in my district. Probably why I have the job that I have today. I didn't work in the same school with him, but he is phenomenal. He's even won the presidential award for math teaching, along with several other things. So I'm going to tell you a story about him in a little bit. But for those of you that are here early, I'd love for you to put something in the chat. If you're watching the recording of this, I'd love for you to pause and say out loud to yourself or someone around you, it might be your child, I'd love for you to tell a story about what is happening in this photo. You can invent a story, you can make something up. Don't worry if you don't know what's going on in this story. I'd love for you to tell a story. You can put it in the chat anytime that you want. What is going on in this picture? And if you have ideas, throw it in there, but you can invent a story. It doesn't matter what the story is. What do you think is happening in this picture? And if you're at home, again, pause the video and say something out loud. Somebody in the chat says, he's excited, he's getting close to the finish line. Yeah, it kind of looks like he might be. What else do you think might be happening in this? Someone running on track. He's in his groove and happy to be where he's at. I'm not sure if he's happy or he's grimacing. If it was me, I would be grimacing as I was doing what he is doing. Either realizing he's going to finish or he's in pain. Thank you for some of the people that are throwing things in the chat. Keep thinking about that picture. I'm going to come back to it. And I'm also going to come back to why I asked you to tell a story about it. This webinar series is based on the 2022 math standards. Specifically, we're doing a 10-part series on Dimension 2, which are the benchmark contexts. There are 5 benchmark contexts that are named in the front matter of our standards. And then throughout all of the 300 plus benchmarks, they are connected to one or more of the benchmarks context, and we're doing a series on what does that mean. As part of our standards, there's a definition of mathematical rigor, which says that we should have an equal intensity on 3 things: procedures and skills, conceptual understanding, and real-world application. And we're spending this series thinking about real-world application. We've talked so far in the first 2 parts of our things about context and story, but students identifying how to use the concepts and skills they're using to tackle novel real-world problems. And so this is a 10-part series. We're going to get to all 5 of the contexts, but we're right here, October 15th, part 3, studying your students and their communities, part 1. And in session 1, I told you a couple stories about my childhood, about my mom and my dad and how I learned math. And in those stories, I told you that math is learned in context. You can go back and watch that half-hour webinar if you want. And I also shared with you 6 reasons why Minnesota K-12 students should be learning math in context. That was session 1. In session 2, I told you another couple stories. I'm going to tell you another story in session 3 today about my dad and about Norway, where my family is from, and the sheep that are there. And I told you that the context behind those photos and the story matters. And I shared with you ideas around that. And we talked about how the contextual in mathematics must be connected to visuals, the verbal mathematic language. There must be graphs and tables and pictures and diagrams and other things that we're connecting that to. And today we're going to study our students, but it's only part 1. In part 2, we're going to get to studying their communities, because one of the questions that you should be asking as you're unpacking and thinking about every single standard and benchmark in the new standards, these are the 3 questions, but we're concentrating on the last question, which is what authentic opportunities exist for application of the standard and benchmark to real world problems. In order to do that, we need to understand the context and story of the students and what they bring to our classrooms. So that's why we're talking about studying our classrooms. Because more than likely, our students aren't wanting us to do a lot more problems that people mock math teachers for about all the watermelons that we're buying at the grocery store. And so when we're talking about context in math, it refers to situating mathematical ideas in everyday, real world, or imaginary or geometric situations. The real world or imaginary situations, narratives, and background information is what's going to give meaning to math concepts and make them relevant to students. And so we're going to be looking at it in this series through these 5 contexts. 2 weeks from now, we'll look at real world context and move on to other ones. So here's my goal for today. We all have students in front of us. They're changing all the time. And to create the conditions for students to learn math and context, we need to start by studying our students and their communities. And so a Minnesota education leader shared a quote with me that said, "We start at the micro level. Our students' lens informs us how we engage and connect with math." And so to create those conditions at the micro level, that's what this session is about. We're going to start with our students. How do we get to learn how they are? I'm going to share a lot of ideas with you, and then we'll start to move in the second part of this series at the macro level, the broader context of how we as a society understand how math shapes our lives. And we'll look at all the other parts of our students' lives that impact how they arrive in our classroom. So how do children learn math? They start with an experience first, and when that experience is connected to the context and story of their lives, that's often something that will engage them in making meaning of the mathematics that will formalize with them. We never want them leaving our rooms without having explicitly made clear the learning of the day. And so as we're thinking about all of these groups of people, we're starting with our students. So let me tell you about the best math teacher I've ever seen teach in person. I actually know a lot about this person, not just because I worked in the same district and spent time with this person and have been to their house, know their children, have met their partner. I also know a lot because the district I was working in had a 5-year longitudinal study of all the middle school teachers, of which I was one at the time, and of all the leadership things that were going on. And there's many articles written about them. I've shared one with you called Launching Complex Tasks that was written about the best teacher I ever knew. That's in our national journals, and it's about a math problem that you can find in a lot of math textbooks in the middle school. It's connected to a standard. In fact, in the 2022 math standards, it's connected to Anchor Standard 7, and it's a problem about 2 brothers walking a race, Henry and Emil, and the older brother gives the younger brother a head start. They're going to walk and race because the older brother knows that they can walk faster, and he wants that race to be a close race. In fact, I've done this problem. I changed the context a little bit to be we created a video. I don't have the video with me anymore of the 2 students, 2 children of my math teacher co-worker. And so we told the story about Gus and Anya, and we filmed a race that they were doing, and students then created a table and a graph, and we connected what was going on in their community was the children of my coworker. Students created equations, and we learned a lot of math, and we started to think about linear equations that were proportional and those that were not proportional and comparing those. So that's the background to my story, but my story also has to do with Minnesota. I've told this story all over the United States. It's about a 5-minute story, and I have to explain to them what the ducks look like on the lakes that we live in. The lakes, when I go by the lakes of Minneapolis, there's a lot of mallard ducks. And so here's my story. I want to tell you the story about Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith has a lot of articles written about him. It's not his real name. He is a real person, though. This is a real picture of him. He is a friend of mine. And he taught at a school in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, when I travel around the country, I have to dismantle what people think about Minneapolis. They think all we have is piles of snow all the time. So I have to tell them that actually most of the year we have beautiful lakes. In fact, Mr. Smith's lakes was school was right next to these lakes. And on those lakes, there's a lot of amazing things happening all the time, including there's all kinds of ducks that are hanging out in those lakes. And so Mr. Smith taught at a K-8 school that was just blocks away from these lakes. In fact, he figured out how to get a grant to put all his kids on bikes, and they would go biking around the whole middle school program. And they had, hundreds of bikes that would take things going. And so at the time he was teaching middle school, I was at the district office working in charge of K-12 math, and I would have principals in my district coming up to me and saying, what resource do you recommend to us, Sarah? What math resource should we get? And really, I knew their underlying question is they were just desperate for a quick fix for their test scores to go up, and they were convinced if they had the right materials, their scores would go up. And then they learned that Mr. Smith had the biggest growth of any teacher in math in our district. And so then they started asking me, what resources Mr. Smith used? Because surely if we use his resource, all our scores will go up. And he happened to be using, at the time, this is years ago, CMP, a connected math, where this task that I just described was from. But if you were to ask Mr. Smith would say he adapted things. So I'm going to tell a story about that because during the study, we had a lot of video that we had of him. I don't have access to that video anymore, but we used it to train teachers in our district. And so I did a lot of training of the new teachers in our district, and one day we were doing training on launching tasks. And so I had a whole bunch of new teachers in front of me, and I invited Mr. Smith to attend the training with me, and we showed the video of 10 minutes of him launching a lesson. And then we asked the teachers to tell us what they noticed Mr. Smith doing in the video. And Mr. Smith, of course, was uncomfortable because who likes to watch videos of yourself? But this video was phenomenal, and it was about this task from CMP. So I don't have the video anymore, so I'm going to tell you what happened in the video using my PowerPoint skills, which are limited. So here we go. The video starts at the beginning of the hour, and Mr. Smith is in the back of the room where he usually taught from. He got low because he wanted students to be centered on the learning, and the bell rings, ring, 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 and on the board it says race walking. And then you hear from the back of the room in the video, Mr. Smith saying, race walking class, what do you know about race walking? And the students kind of looked at him, but one student raised their hand and said, isn't that the race, like the thing where they wiggle their hips and go race walking in crazy ways? And Mr. Smith is like, yeah, get up and show the class. So the student got up and started wiggling his hips to the delight of all the students in the class as he walked across the room, race walking across the room. And so Mr. Smith then said to the class, who is the best race walker in the entire world? The students had no idea. So like often happened with Mr. Smith is he went to Google and he Googled, who is the best race walker in the world? And all these pictures popped up. And Mr. Smith said, wow, all these pictures are a guy named Jefferson Perez. Does anybody in this class know where Jefferson Perez is from? And because of where his school was located, many of the students were from Mexico, and they all raised their hand excitedly and shouted out Mexico, and a bunch of students shouted out Minnesota. And then one student in the back of the class raised his hand and said, I think he's from Ecuador. And Mr. Smith said, how do you know he's from Ecuador? And the student said, well, my family's from Ecuador and I know the flag. And Mr. Smith said, tell us some things about Ecuador. And the students shared a few things about Ecuador that he knew about Ecuador. And then Mr. Smith said to the class, how fast do you think Jefferson Perez can walk? And the class made wild guesses, like 3 feet per hour. And they would sometimes they said 3 pounds per second. Like they just were making wild guesses. And then he had them get up and walk and think about what they were doing. So the whole class was race walking for like 30 seconds. And then they all sat down and he said, today we're going to do a problem that's called a fair race. We're going to have two siblings. We're going to try and have a fair race and end at about the same time. What do you think we've been doing in class the last couple of weeks that is related to today's task? And students raised their hand and said, I think we're going to do something with slope and equations and tables. And Mr. Smith is like, yes, all those things are going to come into play. Some students said graphs, and the student whose family was from Ecuador raised his head and said, I think we're going to do something with rates. And Mr. Smith said, yes, those are all things that you want to consider today. Today I'm going to ask you to describe the walking rates of two brothers as many different ways as you can. And then Mr. Smith handed out one task sheet to each group. Each group was going to work together on that task sheet. And then Mr. Smith spent the hour asking, assessing, and advancing questions. He didn't tell them what to do. He just clarified and advanced their learning as he walked around the room to each of the groups. And all the kids were leaned in on their tables, including the kid from Ecuador who was helping his people at his table do what he's doing. And then I said to the new teachers we were training after we stopped the video, what did you notice about Mr. Smith's launch? And the teacher said all kinds of great things about Mr. Smith. All the students were engaged. He helped them understand the context. He solicited math language from the students. It was fun. Students walking was a visual rate for the students. And so all those things were true. And as the new teachers were talking to one another, Mr. Smith leaned over to me, and I've known him for years, and I've seen this video many, many times. And he said, Sarah, do you know I use race walking as a context, even though this problem isn't about race walking? And I said, no, Mr. Smith, I don't know why. And he's told me, Sarah, most of the students in our middle school program, their families are from Mexico. We only have one student in all of middle school who's from Ecuador, and never once in my class has he ever talked. Has he ever worked with his group? And I was trying to figure out a way to bring his culture into our classroom. And so I did some research and I learned that Jefferson Perez was a race walker. And I was floored because throughout the whole video, that student whose family was from Ecuador had been 100% involved. I did not see the invisible in the classroom that a talented teacher knows in the classroom. So what does that have to do with the ducks in the classroom? Well, I think the ducks on our lakes in Minnesota are similar to my experience with that video. Because have you ever noticed that all the mallard ducks, if you look at their beaks, they look like they're wearing a mask that looks like a dog's face? I had never seen that before until it was pointed out to me. And I had never noticed that really great teachers thought about the students in their classrooms and saw the invisible. And so Mr. Smith had studied his students. He knew his students. In order to launch and his lessons, he adapted them to build on their interests and prior knowledge and who they arrived in the classroom being. And so when he was taking tasks, he made sure they were connected to standards, and then he adapted them to connect with the lived experience of his students. So I started to think about my own students. These are my own students. How can I position my students as knowers and doers of math? How can I make them feel seen in the math that we study? Zaretta Hammonds talks about this. When students have a chance to narrate their lives, put language to their experience, and process their thinking through discourse, they begin to notice and name their own competence and their own competence in math. And so I had been doing that at some level, bringing in the lived experiences of people that were connected to our school, my colleagues' two children who are now graduating from high school, Gus and Anya. But the reason I told you this story is two reasons, and one of them is this is Jefferson Perez. He's considered to be the best race walker that has ever lived, and the only person from the country of Ecuador that's won a gold medal in any Olympics. And so I tell you that story because that's who he is, and I'll tell you another reason about it. So I encourage you to go read this article where they looked at hundreds of videos of Mr. Smith's classrooms and wrote about things that they noticed he was doing. They talk in this article about a different task that he was doing and how he launched it, and they give you very specific things because a lot of times people are concerned, how do I support students? And Mr. Smith taught at one of the poorest schools in our city. How do I support students? That article is a great thing to do that. But I want to spend the rest of our time talking about how do you study students, because a great book that I read by Francis Su, a mathematician at colleges, from his time working with students who were, or adults who were in prison and teaching them math. He said in that book over and over again, every being cries out silently to be read differently. And I've often, as I've traveled around the country speaking, told the story of student A and student B from my classroom. Student A and student B are real people. I can picture them in my head. And I've asked people to compare their students to my students. And after they told me about, they have some classes that are like student A and student B, I tell them that these are both the same student in my classroom. All of these are descriptors of Fartoon. And often people define Fartoon by just this one thing, and they put her in low-level classes. But she was in my Algebra 2 class, and she did phenomenal, even though there was a lot of things against her. And I started studying my students and not looking at the deficits, and instead putting my time into discovering their assets and things that would engage them in the classroom. And Naomi Jessup says, I think there's a difference between teaching standards to students and teaching students standards. The later approach rehumanizes teaching by starting with the students in mind, and that's what I think my friend did. So I started changing what my classroom looked like. This is my classroom. And I'm going to high level tell you how I learned about my students. Number one, this is a non-negotiable for me for the rest of my career. In fact, millions of people have read where I blogged about this and done this in their classrooms. It's so much work the first week of school. I had 170 students when I was doing this, and I did this every single night. It's called name tents. And it's my way that I started to first get to know and study my students. And the inside of the name tent, outside is their name, on the inside looks something like this. And I have them folded on the first day, put their names on it. And then every day at the end of the class, I ask them to write something to me, and then I respond. At the end of the week, it looks like this. I do this for 170 students. Yes, it takes a lot of time, but I do it because in 1 week, I learned so much about my students. On day 4, I often ask them to write me a question, and then I respond. There are students, though, that write very little. I wish I would have taken a picture of the outside of the students, their inside, because the inside I learned very little. But on the outside of their name tent, they had the most beautiful, like, graphic novel art on the outside of their name tent that they put there all week. And one of the first assignments in my class is to create your name in Desmos using vertical and horizontal lines. And the student came up to me when I assigned that and said, hey, I want to do something different, and I want to use not just horizontal and vertical lines. And had I not paid attention, because the student had done very little in my class and spoke very little, I probably would have dismissed the student. But because I knew the outside of their name tag was covered in art, I gave them stuff that we hadn't even learned yet. And this is what the student came back. They took a picture that was on the outside of their name tent and recreated it with equations. They couldn't have stolen it from someone because they'd already created the original art. Second thing that I do, and by the way, I've linked to all these activities. I have my students create a math autobiography. I don't make them write that until I've given them examples of long ones and short ones of people who like math and people who don't like math. Another assignment I give in the first couple weeks of school is I have them tell the story of their name. And they can make up a name. It can be their first name, their last name, and I give examples. I once was observing a teacher in North Carolina, and I looked on her wall. It was the middle of the year. And there's all these beautiful pictures on the wall. And when I looked more closely, they had all kinds of words. When I asked her about them, she said, oh, I give them a Google form where they answer a ton of questions about them, and then I take all those words. And if they say they like basketball, then I use the shade from basketball and take all the words about them and put that in there. We use it all year to refer to all the things that we know about them. And she had some kind of program that she had found that, and every person's picture was different. Had, like, Mia wanted to be a doctor someday, and she put their lived experiences on the walls and referred to them. So as we're studying students, it's also important to know their cultures. The last school I taught at had a lot of East African students at it. And they invited me to go because I had said I was interested in Somali tea and I never had it. And they said, come to the Somali Mall. And so I went with them to the Somali Mall, and at the Somali Mall, I had some of the best sugary mint tea, Somali tea of my life. It was amazing. And I saw this rich culture and business-minded like community there, and I was spending time with my students. I also started centering who I followed on social media very carefully. Even to this day, I'm like, who is connected to my students? Who's connected to people in the state that don't look like me? And so to this day, I'm always very conscious of who I'm following on social media and making sure that the people I'm following, in fact, that's where I learned the most about my students' culture is just simply from the community I choose to follow, what community organizations, and often sometimes there's things I don't agree with. I also have considered the most important 5 minutes of class to not be any time during class time, but the 5 minutes before class in the hallway. I have arranged every single thing I do so that I'm always in the hall between classes because that's the biggest time where I learn the most about my students. And I've had to be intentional about it. I keep this picture up by my desk because I saw it on social media once, and the person said, when I enter a class, I think of this picture because it reminds me that every student is an individual learner, and it's our job to meet their individual needs, and it's my job, Sara, to figure out what their individual needs are. So I keep this next to my desk to remind myself that no two students entering my room are the same. And then I catch them every day. This is my personal calendar. I have 2 students every day that I'm going to catch and have a deeper conversation with. And I'm going to tell them something I know about them. Hey, Oscar, I know that your mom was going to have a baby pretty soon. Has the baby been born? Tell me something about that baby. And what I talk to them about has nothing to do with math. I'm just getting to know them. But I have to be intentional, so I make a schedule for myself in order to have conversations at the hallway. And I learned all this. I'm not going to show you this video, but there's a clip that I've linked to. I might have forgotten to link to it, but I'll link to it as soon as I get off of here. It's from an Oprah show where she was interviewing Toni Morrison, and I've vlogged about it because it changed my life. And Toni Morrison said, let your face speak what's in your heart, because what our students are looking for is for our face to light up. This is me driving in a car, and every time I drive up to my nephew's house, they run out and wave at me, and they're so excited to see me. And even as an adult, it feels so good to do that. So how can I do that for my students? I started putting a play table in my classroom. I was teaching high school. And if you're like, why did you do that? I've blogged about it. It's the best thing I ever did to build relationships with students. All my students gathered around it. Like, look at them. Half of our curriculum walks in the door with the students. I started learning things that I put and adapted into the experiences in my classroom. In fact, students would arrive in my classroom after school for help with math. And what I didn't realize is that this table allowed me to tutor them. We didn't have to look each other in the eye because we were playing around with the things that were on the table. And then we were talking about life and about mathematics. So half the curriculum, I want you to remind yourself, walks in the door with the students. So how are we going to study our students? So last story, if you'll indulge me, is one of my favorite math leaders in the country, she's out of North Carolina, is Lauren Balcom. And I linked to this blog that Desmos put out a couple of years ago called How Should You Launch Tasks? And this is a task about phones charging and how long it's going to take for the phone to charge. And the article had 3 ideas of how to launch this activity so that the students would come up with a question, how long would it take to charge this phone? And so one way they said to launch it is to ask your students, what's the first question that comes to mind when you see this picture? And then they gave examples of what students had said. Then they said a second way you could launch it. By the way, all these ways are great, but I'm going to tell you my favorite in a moment. Its second way is, what do you notice? What do you wonder? I bet a lot of us use that. And you should keep using it. And these are things that students noticed and wondered, and they came up with a question that they were half hoping they would do. But then they worked with Lauren Balcom, and Lauren Balcom said, my favorite way to launch a task is to say the following: invent and tell a story about this image. Remember I said invent or tell a story about the image of the person running? Because as people tell their stories, they often reveal things about themselves. And when they tested out this launched, students started telling stories. Last night I was at the hospital because my brother had broken his arm and we didn't know if our phone would be charged and we had to look for someone who had a charger and blah, 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 blah. And they got the same types of noticing as on Wonderings out. They got to the same endpoint, but they also, in inventing and telling a story, they shared things about themselves. I also love this idea from Sarah Carter, has probably one of the biggest math blogs. She shares everything. And she starts the year with a quiz for them to get to know her. These are the questions about her, but I love the homework she gives that night. And I've linked to this and it's all in the folder, where she has students create 6 questions about themselves, make the multiple choice questions, and then she answers those questions and hands them back to them. Miss Carter, what's my favorite subject? And she takes a guess at that. Miss Carter, what's my favorite study of quantum physics? And she answers all those questions. So I want to encourage you to study your students. We're going to be continuing in part 2 to think about the cultures that they arrive from. I took the definition our state uses for culture that's found from the National Geographic Society, that it's the shared characteristics of a group of people, which encompasses both their place of birth, their religion, their language, their cuisine, social behaviors, art, literature, and music. And that's where we'll be going in part 2 of this thing. So Pam Seda says, spend more time studying your students rather than studying their statistics. Be more like Mr. Smith and take what you know about your students and adapt what you're doing to their lives. Pam Seda has a whole book and a whole framework for thinking about that in her book, Choosing to See. So I hope you'll join me in 2 weeks when we'll be looking at real world context and what that means. It's not watermelons. Everything that I'm sharing in session 3 can be found on this sheet. The recording for this is up there. I realize there's one thing I haven't linked there, but most of the things are linked already, including my PowerPoint. So